Under foreign flags, Moscow sails ghosts on the water. Over the last several years, the nation of Russia has worked quietly to build a shadow fleet, a secretive pack of ships whose ties to Russia are murky at best and whose allegiances are nearly impossible to prove. They carry oil, the lifeblood of the Russian economy, in a long mission to prop their home nation up despite sanctions that should have been crippling. And ever since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine some 2.5 years ago, Moscow's shadow fleet has grown to well over 1,000 in number. But Russia's Grand Shadow Fleet cannot operate all on its own. Russia needs sellers, it needs buyers, and most of all, it needs accomplices. And when it comes to the friends that enable Russia's mysterious ships to sail, none of them have proven themselves quite so valuable as the tiny African nation of Gabon. Ask the country, and it'll say the same thing Moscow does. Russia's shadow fleet is an illusion, a paranoid fabrication. It doesn't exist. But look at how Gabon acts, what Gabon does, and another reality begins to emerge. That tiny little nation more than 5,000 kilometers away might be nothing less than the key to survival for the entire Russian state. The origins of Russia's shadow fleet can trace back for a little over a decade, all the way to Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. Back in those days, the shadow fleet itself was nothing more than a twinkle in Vladimir Putin's eye, and initially, it might not even have been that. For Putin to take Crimea was a gamble, not because the Ukraine of those days could ever make him pay, they very clearly couldn't, but because no matter what international leaders might have said they'd do to respond to such a thing, Russia could only know for sure once they actually rolled the dice. When they finally took action, the US and the European Union responded with economic sanctions meant to punish Russia's wallet and pressure the nation to undo what it had already done on the Crimean Peninsula. Particularly important for the US and Europe was to go after Russian oil, the technology used to find it, the credit used to finance drilling operations, and the people who stood to gain most from Russia's lucrative export. Back then, the sanctions weren't bad enough to force Russia to turn to a shadow fleet to do its business. But it did show how the global West was going to play its hand. In the event that Putin and his allies decided to go for a much bigger prize in a few years' time, the West would respond by focusing on oil in what European and North American political leaders regarded as their best chance at going for the jugular. Imagine this, you're sitting at home, you're minding your business, and then BOOM! A stranger shows up at your door because they somehow found your home address online. Pretty creepy stuff, right? Well, that's not just a wild scenario. It can be a reality, and it's easier than ever for people to dig up your info thanks to something called data brokers. And that's where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. You see, data brokers are companies that collect, store, and sell your personal info. Your name, your phone number, email, home address, even your shopping habits. And they don't ask for your permission, they just do it. Now, you could try and contact those brokers yourself and be like, yo, can you remove my data, please? Well, that would take ages. It would take years. And who's got the time for that? That's where Incogni comes in. They reach out to those data brokers on your behalf. They handle all the back and forth, getting your information deleted, and they keep checking to make sure that it stays off the market. So if you value privacy, and you should, give Incogni a try. It's super easy. Just sign up, let them know whose info to remove, and sit back while they take care of the rest. Plus, they've got a 30-day risk-free guarantee. You got nothing to lose. So, go to incogni.com/warographics and use the code warographics and you'll get 60% off an annual plan. Thanks to Incogni for sponsoring today's video. And now, fast forward to 2022, and that's precisely what happened. Just days after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States had ordered a total ban on the import of Russian oil, gas, and coal. And Europe, despite its reliance on Russian oil, took its own action to ice Russia out of an economic partnership that had once thrived. By the fall of 2022, the nations of the global West were instituting price caps meant to drive Russia to inflation, and Russian crude oil and refinery oil was nearly entirely embargoed by the year's end. These were the sorts of sanctions that, according to those other nations, could have driven Russia's economy into a death spiral if Moscow didn't change its behavior. The Russian economy hadn't exactly been a juggernaut before the war, and now, with Ukraine putting up a far better fight than expected, something had to give. It was about the same time that Moscow decided to take a page out of its allies' book and draw lessons from places like Tehran, Caracas, and Pyongyang. Other world nations had been skirting sanctions for years, taking advantage of loopholes and a near complete lack of practical worldwide maritime law enforcement. Uniquely, Russia didn't just have their playbook to reference. Russia had money that those nations could only dream of, and that money began to flow into acquisitions. According to global trading firms, Russia's shadow fleet comprised up to 6,000 tankers within the first year of the Russia-Ukrainian war. A few months later, the figure crested over 1,000. By October 2023, the analytics firm Windward estimated a figure of 1,400, and the numbers have only grown from there. It is functionally impossible to know how many of the vessels there actually are, but the sheer numbers suggest that a relatively high proportion of the world's entire crude oil transport capability now belongs to the Russian shadow fleet. The ships themselves aren't much to look at, and in a way, that's the point. Most of them are aging and bought second or third hand, with some showing visible signs of disrepair on sections that aren't critical to their core functions. Questions about their ownership will lead back to shell companies and front businesses, and the financial trails they leave behind quite frequently just go cold. Most lack proper insurance, relying instead on insurers that are either badly insufficient, entirely unknown, or in some cases just non-existent. Questions of their intentions usually go unanswered, although a suspicious massing of the vessels in the waters of Sweden's exclusive economic zone right after Sweden joined NATO suggests that perhaps they serve a dual function of intimidation from time to time. They're also bought in secret, they're crewed and financed on the cheap, usually without inspection, and as a result, they've posed an outsized danger not just to other vessels on the water, but to the ocean ecosystem as well. The ships frequently leak oil, they sometimes have larger and more serious spills, and because they'll often quite happily turn off their positioning transponders, they're liable to be hit by other vessels by accident, especially in fog or other difficult conditions. They travel through the perilous Arctic without ice-class hulls. They transfer oil in other countries' territorial waters, and they often refuse contact with nearby nations, even when it might help them avoid danger. In 2023, a Shadow Fleet tanker exploded in Malaysian waters. Others have run aground in China and the Mediterranean, and still others have been left disabled by accidents and internal trouble at sea. When they do have incidents like that, their contents will spill into local waters, and because the ships are functionally uninsured, all the damages will have to be paid by whichever other nation was unlucky enough to be host to an incident. As for why those vessels are out on the water with their transponders off, that gets to the very core of what they're up to: conducting high-risk, unsupervised, and unsanctioned ship-to-ship transfers of oil while on the open ocean. Nations willing to accept Russian oil can't simply accept a ship that sailed from St. Petersburg to their local ports. That sort of traffic is easily monitored and would result in consequences for the country accepting the shipment. But if a tanker leaving from St. Petersburg happens to transfer its oil to another ship, say in the North Atlantic, and then that ship sails to the Bay of Bengal to transfer to another ship, and that third ship makes yet another transfer in the South China Sea, then ship number 4, still carrying the same cargo, can get to a friendly port without raising questions. Why? Well, because those same transponders have been shut off whenever it's convenient, and the movement of all 4 ships has been a mystery this whole time. Repeat that process enough times, with enough ships, and Russia's oil economy can keep functioning. And that's precisely what's happened. Yet as murky and fascinating as the Russian Shadow Fleet is, it's still just only one half of the real story at play in global waters. This entire approach to secret oil shipping falls apart very easily if every single ship of the Dark Fleet is flying the flag of Mother Russia. In fact, none of the ships can be flying that flag, and just like how a nation accepting an oil tanker that sailed directly from Russia would raise eyebrows, a nation that hands out its flags to be placed on Russian shadow ships would quickly start to look like an accomplice. Russia needs international partners that either don't get caught placing their flags on Russian ships or that don't particularly care if they get caught, and that's where the nation of Gabon comes into play. The involvement of Gabon is a new phenomenon for the Shadow Fleet, but one that's been all but impossible to miss for people who've been watching the problem for some time. Officials who watch over territorial waters where the Shadow Fleet operates frequently have attested to a rapid expansion in the number of Gabonese flags off their shores. According to the trade analysis firm Windward, some 5.5% of all worldwide so-called grey vessels, regardless of their suspected affiliation, fly the flag of Gabon, and that's a very new change that's come just as Russia has moved from its status as a leading provider of grey ship flags to third place. And that, despite Gabon barely being a player in the maritime industry at all prior to last year, and having next to no domestic cause to have more tankers under its flag. It's not just a fast-growing ship register, it is the world's fastest ship-growing register. With the change, Gabon joins a list of about 40-odd nations that supply so-called flags of convenience to ship owners without asking questions. Ship registration in Gabon is relatively cheap. The nation has very little ability or will to conduct any oversight of the people registering under its flag, and regulations within the country are lax at best. Other countries know full well that if an incident with a Gabon-flagged ship happens in their waters, it's not even worth their time to try and negotiate compensation through Gabon, a country that has neither the resources nor the reputation that would suggest any interest in compliance. And since Gabon has its own oil and mining-based economy, it's not likely to be a place that other countries are in a rush to sanction. After all, Gabon fills many of the same trade gaps that sanctions against Russia helped to create. As for why Gabon in particular caught the attention of Moscow, the answer appears to trace back to the events of last August, when Gabon endured a successful military coup. When it comes to Russia's partners in Africa, Moscow loves a good coup, and it's thrown its support behind other military juntas on the continent, including Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and at varying times both the junta in Sudan and the paramilitary group trying to overthrow it. When Gabon's army officers launched its own coup, Russia initially appeared somewhat worried about the outcome. After all, the prior Gabonese government had been a friend and a valued ally. But the new regime appears to have been even more helpful than the prior one, as it's the Gabonese junta that's led the country to drastically expand its role in the shipping industry. And Gabon has been useful to Russia in other ways too. In one example, a Gabonese company was found in 2024 to have exported nearly $1.5 billion worth of spare aircraft parts to Russia. Gabon allegedly imported them from elsewhere in a clear attempt to help Russia avoid sanctions that should prevent Russian combat aircraft from being properly maintained. It's one in a long series of steps that Russia has taken to expand its role in Africa. Across the continent, Russia has built a range of transactional relationships with dictators, military juntas, and popularly elected leaders. Russia presents itself as a security partner to these nations, sometimes dispatching troops from the remnants of the paramilitary Wagner group, and sometimes lending economic and diplomatic cover to aid those African nations in their own goals. In return, those nations end up basically in the unenviable position of having to give Moscow basically whatever it asks for. In some places, that means the extraction of natural resources, gold, precious gems, cobalt, copper, nickel, and more. In other places, apparently including Gabon, these nations use their mix of global obscurity, malleable legal systems, and previous lack of engagement with Russia to do favors, like in Gabon's case, flagging a ton of ships that Gabon has no intention of actually regulating. It's a trade-off that probably does more for Russia in the end than it does for those nations, but in today's world, those nations are often choosing between positive relations with Russia and either complete disinterest or debt trapping from just about everyone else. And on a continent with several dozen nations on offer, Russia gets the operational versatility to stay ahead of Western sanctions. If the West decides to sanction ships flagged to Gabon, then that's all right. With a wink and a nod from dear old Uncle Vlad, landlocked Burkina Faso might inexplicably get active with its own ship registry, and as the Gabonese blue, yellow, green tricolor comes down, the Burkinabe green and red with its single golden star can go right up in its place. The Russia-Ukrainian war is closer to the start of its fourth year than the start of its third, and so far, the Russian economy has proven to be a long way off the collapse that most Western leaders had expected. In fact, the Russian economy is growing. And while there are a whole range of reasons why that's the case, Moscow's ability to dodge sanctions is tremendously important. Now Russia is shifting its economy onto a war footing for the long term, setting the conditions for it to do decently well in the event that the Ukrainian military and the global financial system continue to engage in a long attritional battle against it. And with the country's shadowy maritime vessels doing such a good job keeping Russia's export economy afloat, its role appears to be growing rather than shrinking. Over the last few months, Russian shadow vessels have diversified the loads they carry. Now the ships carry not just oil, but chemical products, with cargo that often ends up in India and China. They're also beginning to transport liquefied natural gas, or LNG, a critical commodity that could become a gold mine for the Kremlin if used correctly. Moscow is a leading world exporter of the stuff, but after Europe stopped accepting most of its prior imports by pipeline, that product and the resulting profit has been on the table. Per maritime trade observers, Moscow appears to now be adapting its shadow fleet for LNG shipments, and it's on the hunt for buyers in a market dominated by the United States and its close ally Australia. These are problems that the rest of the world can address if it wishes to try again and claim some of the success it initially hoped for with its sanctions regime. But the path to doing so is a difficult one. As we mentioned previously, maritime law enforcement is sorely lacking around the world, with some countries capable of patrolling their territorial waters and exclusive economic zones, but no global body that has the means to keep order across international waters. Individual nations and coalitions can sometimes establish order in particular parts of the world. For example, one such coalition is attempting to lock down the Red Sea against the drone and missile threat presented by Yemen's Houthi rebel organization. But there simply aren't enough ships, and nor is there enough international cohesion to do that sort of work across the whole world at once. It's not likely that any organization will be put together anytime soon, especially because it would be very difficult to establish its legitimacy without the support of Russia, its global allies, or nations like India and China that seem to benefit directly from the status quo. Now, maritime law does exist, but there are only limited means to enforce it at the best of times. As Russia's shadow fleet shows, even the agreements the world does have to attempt to regulate the oceans, they're weak, and they're losing what strength they do have. If Europe, the United States, or somebody else can change the game, then perhaps Russia may face some trouble yet with its shadow fleet. But for the time being, this is a contest that Russia appears to have decisively won. Perhaps Russia can take Ukraine, perhaps it cannot. But with the help of its shadow fleet, and with tiny allies like Gabon playing a way outsized role, the economic backbreaking that the West was hopeful for will remain elusive for as long as this war goes on.